And good morning. How's everybody doing today? Holy cow. Okay. It's good to see you folks. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I hope everybody's doing all right today. Just a quick little problem there. Whoa, with the start. Hi, Eli. Good to see you. Rasha. Good to see you. De'Erica. Good to see you. Sarah King, Andrea Nicole, Imani. Good to see everybody. If you're in the chat bar, if you're in the class today, go ahead and type hello into the chat. It's good to see everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thanks for coming today. Hi, everybody. Good morning, Cole. Good morning, Rasha. Good morning, De'Erica. Good morning, Sarah. It's good to see everybody. Hello, Imani, if you're still here. Hope y'all are having a good day. Uh-oh, I got a pen in my back pocket that I need to take out before I break it. The exam review. Yes, great question. Great question, Andrea. Remember, we do have an exam this weekend, exam number 2. The exam will be available tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And we will be having the live webinar at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. I'm more of a coffee guy, Eli. I don't have a problem with tea. It's just I usually pick coffee. Why, are you a tea guy? Hi, thanks for coming, Imani. Good to see you as well. Andrea was just asking about the review session. Yes, we are having a review session tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Of course, it'll be recorded. If you can't make it to the live review session, then you can just watch the recording. That'll be available in your exams folder all weekend long. It's good to see everybody. Anybody got any questions so far? That was a great question, Andrea. Thank you. Anybody have anything they want to share? Did somebody do anything fun yesterday? It's been such a beautiful day outside the last couple of days. Has anybody been outside doing anything fun? Eli drinks tea in the morning and coffee in the afternoon. Caffeine is actually relaxing. You know what? Maybe I have ADHD and it's undiagnosed because coffee seems to relax me as well, Eli. It's kind of strange that way. For me, coffee has always gone well with school, right? So here's to you, Eli, a fellow caffeine lover. It's great to see you. Okay. I hope we've got a good crowd in here. It looks like we have just a couple of people. I'm sorry about the little freeze up with the broadcast intro. Sometimes my internet gets a little silly, but I am online. Fantastic. Okay, it looks like we're back up to 5 or 6. So hopefully everybody who was here at the beginning of the broadcast. If you just got in, I am sorry about the little snafu right at the beginning. My system froze up. I had to go ahead and get that started. I've got to download a new update for the OBS system, so I'm going to be downloading that later today, and hopefully that'll take care of any of these technological glitches that we have. Don't forget the exam review tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. live on YouTube. If you can't make it to the live broadcast, that's okay. You can watch the broadcast as a recording as soon as it ends. Okay, so without further ado, let's talk a little bit about IQ testing. We're going to talk about the evaluation of IQ tests. What are they good for? What are they bad for? We're going to talk about some differences that you might see between groups on IQ tests and what those differences mean. And then we can talk about newer theories of what it means to be intelligent. And I'll tell you how many kinds of intelligence there are. You know what? Actually, let me text my son while I'm thinking about this, because he's got a book I want to show you. And my son's name is Chris as well. Chris Jr. I'm Chris. Holy cow. I am so sorry. I am not sure what's going on with OBS, but it's had 2 glitchy days in a row. So I probably need to get to some tech support and see if I can figure out what's going on. Can you folks hear me now? Can you folks see me? Hopefully everything's cleared up. Yes. I do apologize. I do apologize for that. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to evaluate tests. What are they good for? What are their problems? We're going to talk about group differences that you might see on IQ, and then we're going to talk about newer theories of intelligence. I am so sorry. I'm not sure what's happened to OBS the last couple of days. I just got a new download notification in the email, so I'll figure that out. But I do apologize. Okay. Okay. You know what IQ tests are? It's very important that we get IQ tests because they hold a lot of power in our society. You know what? An IQ test in second grade can change your entire educational path for the next 10 years of your life and set you up to go to college or not to go to college, right? IQ tests are used in court settings to affect your legal standing. You know what? You can receive the death penalty based on your IQ score. You know what they affect? They affect. Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! They affect with a V. I'm sorry, that should be a V. An A. They affect hiring and clinical psych decisions. Goodness me. Uh, so you can get hired based on an IQ test or not hired based on an IQ test. You know what? Your IQ test may be used to hold you against your will in a clinical psych setting. IQ tests are incredibly important, man. They hold a ton of power in our society. So it is very important that they be accurate. Now, what I want you to do for the rest of the day, or actually from now on, is to think of an IQ test as a measurement tool. Now, what are some examples of measurement tools that we use in our society? Can somebody please tell me what kind of measurement tool do you consistently use or do we use? A measurement tool. Give me examples of measurement tools. Hmm? Can anyone think of a measurement tool? I can think of one, a tape measure. That's a measurement tool. Can somebody think of another measurement tool? What's another example of one? Anybody trying to lose weight? A bathroom scale, absolutely. And you know what, just like a bathroom scale measures your weight, and a ruler or tape measure measures length. There you go. A gas meter, yes, to look at the number of molecules. Oh, a gas meter, like if you're pumping fluid gas. Yes, absolutely, Melody. And think about it. The gas companies want that meter to be as accurate as possible. Heck, you want that gas meter to be as accurate as possible, right? And so what I want you to understand is that a measurement, an IQ test, is also a measurement tool. And just like we want a bathroom scale to be accurate and valid and reliable, just like we want a tape measure to be valid and reliable, just like we want that gas meter to be reliable and accurate, just like we want, yes, wow, that's another brilliant, that's a good intellectual thing. Andrea says a grading rubric. Absolutely, because you want your grade to be reliable. You don't want to do the same work as somebody else and have your teacher grade that test 10 points, their work 10 points higher than yours. Wow, that's a great example, Andrea. Just like we want these tools to be accurate, we need IQ tests to be accurate and reliable. The question is, are they accurate and reliable? And how much faith should we put in IQ tests? Now, the subfield of psychology that is interested in helping develop better and more reliable testing tools is the subfield of psychometric, the psychometrician. psychometry would probably be the way to say it, psychometry. So they actually have a psychometrics program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where you can go there and become a PhD psychometrician. What does it mean to be a psychometrician? It means that you understand how to develop and evaluate testing tools. Now, we have anxiety tests, we have depression tests, we have bipolar tests, we have personality tests, we have IQ tests. All of these things are designed to measure qualities of the human mind. And we say that these qualities of the human mind are fixed and can be measured. So it is very important that we have psychometricians to help us design and evaluate IQ tests. Did I bang on that point hard enough? Now, what are the three things that you need to think about when you're talking about the two things we're going to talk about? There are actually several things, but we're going to talk about the two basic ones included in your book. We're going to talk about reliability and validity. A, does the measurement tool give you the same measurement every time? If you jumped on a bathroom scale and it said 85 pounds, and then the next time you jumped on it, it said 115, and then the next time you jumped on it, it said 65, and then the next time you jumped on it, 140. If you went out and got a bunch of measurements on a bathroom scale and they were all different, your bathroom scale would be low in reliability. We want the same thing for IQ tests. If I measure Andrea Nicole's IQ today, I should get the same measurement today and tomorrow and the next day because I'm measuring a fixed quality. That's called reliability. The second quality that we want to test is we want to make sure that the test measures exactly what it is intended to measure, right? So instead of having a tape measure with inches, if I had that tape measure and I put pounds on it, and I told you use that tape measure to measure your length, and I said, okay, your shoe is 5 pounds long, you would say, what the hell are you talking about, Chris? You are not measuring what you think you are measuring. To the degree that a tool measures what it is intended to measure, it is a valid tool. So you know what we want with IQ tests? We want IQ tests that are reliable and valid. We want IQ tests that are reliable and valid. All right. Now, so let's talk a little bit about reliability. The tool gives the same measurement each time the same thing is measured. We want IQ tests that are going to show consistent measurements. All right. Now, how do we assess reliability? Well, there's several different ways you can test the reliability of a psychometric tool. One of the ways in which we do it is we do what's known as test retest. We measure the same thing a couple of different times. So we'll measure the same particular person. And you know what? If I give you the Stanford Binet test today, and then I give you the Stanford Binet test in 9 months, you should score the same both times, right? You know, another way to assess the reliability of an IQ test on one testing is to break that test up into the odd and even questions. So you know what? I could give you my Psych 150 exam, and if it is a reliable test of your psych ability, I should be able to split it in half, and then those two halves should correlate with one another. If you get a 95 on the odd items, you should get a 95. You should average 95% on the even items, right? And so that's what we call split half reliability. And you know what? Sometimes, since we have several different types of IQ tests, we may measure IQ tests to see if they come to the same measurement. And we would call that alternate forms reliability. Okay? Now, here's the deal. Are IQ tests valid? You know what? Are reliable? You know what? They are. Whatever it is, IQ. Now, I'm not saying it's intelligence. And in fact, if you were in webinar the other night, you know that it's definitely not completely what intelligence is. Whatever IQ is can be reliably measured beginning at the age of 4. If you are in the 75th percentile for 4-year-olds, you know what? You'll be in the 75th percentile for 14-year-olds. You'll be in the 75th percentile for 24-year-olds and for 34-year-olds. more or less. You might change a percent or two, but IQ, whatever it is, can be reliably measured at starting at the age of 4. So IQ tests are really, really reliable measurements of something. Now, are IQ tests a valid measure of what? Well, it depends on what you say. Excuse me. It depends on what you mean by validity. Okay, now, there are different ways to think about validity. IQ tests certainly look like they measure intelligence. If you've ever seen an IQ test or taken an IQ test, you'll know that it looks pretty much like a school test. So that's what we would call face validity. When we design a new test, it sounds kind of silly, but when you design a new test to measure anxiety or bipolar or whatever it is a person may have, you need to ask questions that look like they are relevant, right? That's what we call face validity. IQ tests definitely look like they measure intelligence. Now, is an IQ test predictive? Well, it depends on what you are measuring. If you are measuring, now how do we assess validity? Well, we use the tool and see if it predicts an outcome that we think is related to that ability. So here's the logic. IQ tests measure, let's say, intelligence. School takes intelligence, therefore, people with higher grades should do higher IQ tests should do better in school. And it turns out IQ tests are very good predictors of your academic performance. IQ tests are very useful in academic settings. However, we tend to think about IQ tests and intelligence as being larger than just what you do in school. If you were in class on Thursday night, I suggested to you, actually, we suggested to each other that there are lots of different ways to think about being intelligent. In fact, Imani or Melody, somebody that was there on Tuesday, what were some of the alternate intelligences that you suggested in your group work? We got around to that. Did anybody have a different type of intelligence? Here's the thing. The biggest complaint about IQ tests is that they seem to measure a very limited kind of intellectual ability. It just measures one type of intelligence. It doesn't measure creative thinking. It doesn't measure your street smarts. It doesn't measure your emotional intelligence, as Imani says. Absolutely. And so there are great questions about IQ tests and their content validity. Does it really, really, really measure intelligence? Well, it measures part of intelligence, but not all of intelligence. Self awareness, that's another good one. Yes. In self awareness, emotional intelligence, your creativity, these are all parts of intelligence that do not get measured on IQ tests. So here's what I'd say about IQ tests. They're a reliable measure of something. What is that something? Well, it's something that looks like intelligence. It's something that predicts how well you'll do in school. But does an IQ test really tell us how intelligent, using the round term of that word, how intelligent you are? I would say probably not. Okay, it leaves out a lot of what we would consider to be qualities of intelligence. Now, there's another problem with the validity of IQ tests. They seem to show ethnic and cultural differences. All right. Now, if you look at the distributions of IQ scores as I've got presented over here in the bottom left hand corner, what you're going to see is that these distributions show differences among these ethnic groups. So your Asian students seem to score highest on IQ test compared to other groups. Sure, Caucasian students seem to score next higher. And then what you see are the Hispanic and African American populations that seem to lag a little bit behind. You know what else is true? Men don't score as well on average as do females. So the average IQ scale for males is not as high as it is for females. You know what? I'll tell you another really crazy gender difference. Although women in general have higher IQ scores on average, what you're going to find is that there are more male geniuses and there are more male intellectually deficient people. So while females are going to have a higher average IQ, you're going to see more males at each end of the extreme parts of the distribution. So what do we make? Uh, what do we make of all these differences? Emotional quotient is a measure of your emotional intelligence. So there was a question on this week's homework. I can tell that's what you're asking, Brian. Now, an EQ is not measured on an IQ test. They are completely different. EQ is a theoretical idea, actually a test that we would say hasn't been validated, that is used to measure your emotional intelligence or your emotional functioning. I use those interchangeably, and I do apologize for that inconsistency on the homework, Brian. Great question. So, what do we make of these differences? Um, are Asian students really smarter, more intelligent than other people? Uh, you may not feel that way. Are females really smarter than males? I don't want to believe that. I don't want to believe that either. So, what the question is, what do we make among these differences in races, ethnicities, cultures, males, females, sexes? What are they? Are they fundamental human differences? Are you really not as smart as a race as another race? Are males really dumber than females? Or is there some sort of bias with the test? Is there some sort of quality that the test maker didn't see that is included in the test that creates what we would call an artificial artifact, something that's sort of hidden in the test of interest? Maybe these tests are biased. And the crazy thing is, as long as we've had IQ tests around, they've shown these ethnic and gender differences, and people have wondered what it means. Now, if you'll remember, we talked about eugenics in Tuesday night webinar, and I suggested to you that people were sterilized based on their IQ tests. Well, if you look at these scores over here, what you're going to think about, your next thought is that, you know what, maybe some groups of people are going to be sterilized more often than other groups of people. And so what you're going to see is you're going to see sort of a a a what would we call it? A prejudicial or racist tinge in this eugenics program, simply because minorities were more often at the bottom of the distribution that was used to decide who was going to be sterilized. And so what you see is these ethnic differences have real impacts. They determine who goes to college in eugenics. They determine who is going to be sterilized. So what do we do with these very, very important differences? Mental development done in second and third grades plays a role with the gender differences. Maybe it does, Andrea, but here's the weird thing. Mental development. But does that mean that females are acculturated uh, differently than males, or is there a biological innate difference? Because if it's a difference in acculturation, then our IQ test isn't measuring intelligence as much as it's measuring cultural adaptation, right? You know what I mean? And so, if an IQ test is based on how many years of school you got and not necessarily your intellectual, your cleverness, then we're not measuring intelligence as an aptitude, we're measuring intelligence as achievement. Do you folks remember when I talked about the difference between aptitude and achievement on Tuesday? An IQ test is supposed to be a measure of how clever you are, how quickly we could teach you. So if it shows a cultural differences, then it's maybe not measuring exactly what we thought it would measure. I hope that point makes sense. So what do we do with these differences? All right. Uh, we design different tests that don't show ethnic differences, maybe. It turns out that most of the cultural differences that you're going to see, Andrea, occur in the verbal side of the IQ test. Just like on Tuesday, I suggested to you that IQ tests have sort of a nonverbal part and a verbal part. It turns out that you're going to see the biggest differences among ethnicities, among genders, on the verbal parts of the IQ test, your word knowledge, your general knowledge, your ability to remember facts and stuff. You're going to actually see verbal scores are going to be higher for females than for males, for Caucasians than for African Americans. So the difference appears to occur in language. And if you think about it, language is a product of culture. So you could say that we have a cultural artifact that's messing up our IQ tests, yes. Or, like Andrea says, it does turn out that females use more of their brain for verbal abilities than do males. That's why females talk earlier during development. That's why they're ready for kindergarten earlier than males. Uh, that's why most of you females, that's why some females will complain that they think their boyfriends or male romantic partners are not communicative enough. Females do use more of their brain for intellectual ability. So for the intellectual ability of language. So what do these test differences mean, especially if they only occur in the verbal part of the test? Is it a cultural difference? Is it a biological difference? What do we make of this? So how about we just create a test that has no language in it, more of a logical test. And there actually is an example of one of these. It's called the Ravens matrices. Now, here's the deal. The Ravens matrices doesn't really have the reliability or validity checks that your testing tool of the IQ is going to have. And you know what? These Ravens tests aren't very good at helping us determine who has a learning disorder. So they're not as useful. One of the things that are very useful about IQ tests, even though you can only really use them in school, that's where their main use is, their best use is, they are really helpful in helping us diagnose the nature of somebody's learning disorder. The Ravens matrices don't predict academic performance, and they don't work very good for helping us with in applied settings. So we have this IQ test. It's biased, shows cultural differences, shows gender and sex differences, but it allows us to help diagnose people's learning disorders. So what do we think of IQ tests? Are they are the costs worth the problems that we have? Right now, some people decide to account for these differences when making judgments based on IQ tests. I don't know if any of you folks have followed it in the news, but over the last several years, there have been lawsuits against colleges based upon standardized tests like the IQ test and their use in college admissions. So some colleges are saying that your Asian students have to score higher to get into school than do your Caucasian or your minority students. A lot of people talk about minority initiatives in higher education, and they don't think it's fair that this group doesn't have to score as high on a standardized test as this group or as this group. So what do? Do we try to make a test that doesn't have these differences? Well, we can do that, but it's not as useful in predicting school performance, which is where we really use IQ tests. Or do we make allowances for the fact that there are these group differences on IQ tests? And a lot of people think that making these exceptions are not fair as well. In fact, what I'd like to do right now is tell me which of these two option seems better to you? What do you think is the better? To try to design a test maybe that's not as useful, or would you rather have a test and just account for the differences in them? Uh, I'd be interested in seeing your comments in the chat bar as we go on. Now, the other weird thing with these tests is people's beliefs also affect them. So I'm a social psychologist, so I know all about how group functioning, and the groups that we make in our mind. Stereotypes are groups. Your belief about what Caucasians are, about what African Americans are, about what males are, and what females are. These stereotypes that we have are socially created things. We create beliefs about ourselves and our groups. And as a social psychologist, I'm an expert in that. And if you look right underneath me, what you find is a little bit of data to suggest to you that stereotypes that we have developed here in the United States also impact people's ability to perform on IQ tests. How many of you are very nervous about taking a test? Do any of you get test anxiety before you take a test? If you do, go ahead and type in the chat bar and tell me if you get test anxiety. Well, you know what? What if you were in a group that was historically seen to not do well on a particular test? Don't you think that would get in your mind? Dearica, if you were taking a test and right before they handed you this test, the person said, you know what? People whose names start with the letter D just cannot seem to ever pass this test. That would put anxiety in your brain, right? And so the weird thing is, it turns out that for some African Americans, um, because they buy into this stereotype that African Americans don't score as well on these IQ tests, if you give them a test and tell them it's an IQ test, they are going to conform to the stereotype that they have in their head. So all of us have stereotypes, and you Caucasian students have Caucasian and African American stereotypes. You Caucasians, you African Americans and Hispanic students, you have stereotypes of your own groups as well as of Caucasians. There are stereotypes of Asian students. We all have stereotypes. And even though a stereotype may be directed at you and may be negative, we still buy into these social constructions. And I'll talk about that when we get to social psychology. And it turns out that there is evidence to suggest that stereotype threats, all right, the fear that the belief that you're not going to do well because you're in a particular group, it does seem to affect academic performance. So you see in the chart right below me in the diagnostic section, they've told the African American and white students that these are IQ tests. And you see we have a big difference between these two groups. In the second group, they told them, hey, here's a problem solving test. They didn't tell them it was an IQ test. The anxiety and fear that went away with that was with that evaluation went away, and this gender difference went away. So it's kind of weird. Are these things related to biological differences in our brain? Are they based upon how the test was made? Because the person making the test was in this group or that group? Or is it based on cultural stereotypes that we've developed about who does well or does poorly on an IQ test? So in a sense, there are great questions about whether or not IQ tests really measure aptitude or whether or not they measure cultural knowledge or stereotype threat. Okay. Um, IQ test in second and third place, role with gender differences. Erica, so Brian Wilson would like to have the test with differences and just account for the differences. I like that. At least you can calculate those differences and begin to make assessments based on those. But you know what? How does that make people feel when they are actually out in the world? If I come in and I know that you got in here with 10 lower points on average than me, how am I going to judge you as a colleague in this academic setting, right? Brian, that might affect how I feel. It looks like we have a lot of people Are they really measuring cultural differences? The means seem close together, right? Well, these means are probably 8 to 10 points away. And Brian brings up a really good point. Even though there are some variations among some of these differences, uh, the graphs still overlap quite a bit. Now, if you look at the difference of your Asian and Caucasian students, see where the blue and the red uh, uh, bell curves cross, look at that little point, that intersection point, and then compare that with the intersection point of the green and the yellow bell curves. And what you're going to see is that's about 15 points. 15 points means quite a bit in the testing world, Brian, unfortunately. In fact, 3 or 4 points will keep you out of gifted education. And in fact, there are articles, and you know what? I'll bring one to webinar tonight for those who come. There are actually evidence to suggest that minority students do not get into gifted education nearly as often as Asian and Caucasian students. And the question is, are there really differences this important that we should be stratifying based upon ethnicity at second grade? And so think about it. If 10% of your Asian and Caucasian students get into gifted education, or let's say 5%, that's the top 5%, and only 1% of your Hispanic students make it into gifted education, 5% over 1% every year, every year in our educational system is going to start to create its own cultural divide, Brian. Do you see what I'm talking about? So 1 and 2%, they may not look like they make sense, but over millions of people every year, they can begin to cause some divides between cultures. It's sort of it's the sort of the inherent bias that's in the system. Uh, that people who talk about what do they call that, critical race theory? There are these biases that are built into the system that we're not really aware of, Brian. And these small differences can create deviations and divisions in our society. So I would say these IQ tests were created by Caucasian males. Now, here's the crazy. Now, I heard this, it's a legend. I'm not sure true, not true. But I've heard on these early tests, there were test questions that showed differences between males and females. And these questions were thrown out of early IQ tests because the assumption was the test shouldn't show a difference between males and females. On the other hand, some of these questions show differences between white and non white groups, and these questions were kept in the early IQ tests because the assumption was yes, there are differences between these two groups. So the early tests were actually developed with these assumptions in mind. These assumptions create differences between the groups that then are used in academic settings, which heighten these differences between these groups. So is it more genes than environment? Holy cow, that's a great question. And I'm going to go ahead and answer that by sorting out the factors that affect IQ. Great question, Imani. Is it nature or nurture? You know what? It turns out, well, in the way that we can measure IQ differences, IQ and personality show a very strong genetic component. I'm going to talk about that over the course of the semester, and we're going to talk about it right now with regard to intelligence. Behavioral genetics is a branch of science that attempts to assess the impacts of genes on a particular trait or behavior. The behavioral genetics is interested in genotypes and phenotypes. And so what they do is they look at large groups of people who have differing levels of genetic similarity, and they look at how correlated traits are with genetic similarity. So the word we use is concordance rates. Concordance rates is how often two people who are compared on a given trait are similar. So, what is the concordance rate between identical twins? How similar are their IQs? How similar are their personalities? Okay, and so in behavioral genetics, what we do is we compare people of different genetic similarities on a trait of interest. And if we show that their similarity increases on that trait as their genetic similarity increases, then you begin to suggest that that trait is related to your genes. And anytime you hear in the news about this particular quality shows a genetic component, this particular quality shows a genetic component, this is exactly what they're doing. They're just looking at twins, sisters, cousins, and random people on the street, and they're assessing how similar they are on the traits. All right. And so, what you can do, two identical twins share 100% genetic similarity. So, identical twins should show the highest concordance levels on a genetic trait. If you have a sibling or a fraternal twin, then you have 25%. What is it? You have, excuse me, let's see, fraternal twins, siblings have zero point 0.5. I thought it was 0.25. I thought you had zero point 0.5 genetic similarity with your parents. I thought it was 0.25 with siblings. Oh, well, at any rate, so what you'll see here, wait a minute, genetic similarity, siblings, 0. Siblings. Okay. You know what? Don't pay attention to that thing on the bottom. Basically, siblings are 25% genetically similar. You're 50% genetically similar with your parents, and you are 100% genetically similar with identical twins. All right. And so, what we do is we look at these different groups, and we should show that your similarity goes up on that trait goes up as the IQ similarity goes up. And what you're going to see down here in the far left thing is that identical twins over here on the right raised together show about a zero point 0.8 correlation on their IQ scores. So there is incredible similarity on identical twins raised together in terms of their IQ ability. Now you might say, well, they were raised by the same parents in the same household. This is true. But what they do is they then compare them to identical twins who were raised apart. And do you see that? Identical twins raised apart in the blue line, the far right corner of that graph. You'll notice that their IQ is still almost as similar as identical twins raised together. They have almost the same concordance rate on IQ tests. Now, go down here and look at just siblings or siblings over here on the far left. You'll see siblings raised together and siblings raised apart. Now, siblings are not don't have nearly as much genetic similarity. And if you look at their IQ test scores aren't correlated as strongly as well. Now, that's still a pretty good correlation. A 0.45 correlation is still significant. That still says that genes are significantly affecting the correlation, the IQ scores, but not nearly as strongly as for identical twins. So do you see the difference between identical twins raised together and identical and regular siblings raised together? See how the correlation drops from 0.8 to 0.5? That difference right there is used as evidence that genes are important in determining your IQ scores. Now, if you'll notice that your siblings raised together and siblings raised apart, there is a decent drop between these two groups, but I would still tell you that a 0.4 correlation and a 0.2 correlation are kind of similar as well. Now, the fact that the IQ correlation drops just a little bit there, you might use that as evidence to suggest that the environment affects your IQ as well. So, is it nature? Is it nurture? It is both, Imani. But I would say that IQ shows a much stronger genetic correlation than does uh, than an environmental correlation. Now, the mistake here is that people take differences that can be measured within family and then start to make assumptions about different ethnic groups. And so, if I can show that peas grown from the same pod, right, show genetic similarity, then what I do sometimes is I will compare different plants. But here's the thing, different plants have completely different genes. And just because you can show genetic similarity in one family, you can't use that to make assumptions about the differences between males or females, or between African Americans and uh, Caucasians or Hispanics or Asians, because there are no genetic comparisons that can be made. Behavioral genetics can only show how genes work within families. The only problem is people see how well it works within families, and then they take this and inaccurately apply it to differences among ethnic groups. Okay, and that is not the truth. Now, if you look below me, there is, one of the things that your doctors are most interested in, we hinted at this a little bit in chapter 4, is that your baby is of normal birth weight. And we know that smoking causes babies to be born with low birth weight. And one of the things we find is there are a lot of negative outcomes associated with being a low birth weight baby. Now, don't take that personally. All of you are super duper smart, and I know you may have been born with a low birth weight. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to have problems. It means on average, you're more likely to have problems. And what you'll see is that there is a strong correlation between birth weight and IQ. This is sort of an environment, a demonstration of the impact of environment. So, the first 9 months of your life, when you're developing in the womb, definitely has an impact on your IQ abilities right here. And low birth weight babies are more likely to have intellectual disabilities. And so that's why we care so much about good prenatal development, because this is one time when environment will affect your intellectual ability. Right now, here's the deal. I'm running out of time, so I'm not really going to have time to do a great job on this. But if IQ tests don't fully measure intelligence, then what exactly is intelligence? Now, I will tell you that when Alfred Binet made the first IQ test up, nobody told him, hey, create a test of intelligence. They said, instead, what they told him was, create a test that helps us find out who's going to do poorly in school. So the first IQ tests were not developed with an eye towards what is this thing called intelligence. That comes later when people start to question an IQ test. And then people start to ask the question, if IQ isn't all of what it means to be intelligent, what exactly does it mean to be intelligent? And so your book talks about two alternate theories of intelligence that take this theory and expand it out. So this chart right here, I talk about what generalized intelligence is. That's the IQ test. All right. And then underneath it, we've got different sorts of theories that sort of expand the concept of intelligence. We can talk about fluid versus crystallized intelligence, so your ability to solve problems versus your knowledge of facts. Fluid intelligence is your ability to solve problems. Crystallized intelligence is your knowledge for facts. These two types of intelligence were discovered when they looked at how intelligence changes as we get older. And it turns out that your fluid ability, your ability to solve problems and think flexibly, is the part of your intellectual functioning that declines the most steeply as you get older. And your knowledge for facts doesn't really go away as you get older. And so that's one way to think of intelligence. Let's think of it as your knowledge, which maybe IQ tests measure your knowledge. And then let's think of it as your ability to solve problems and think flexibly, or your fluid intelligence. So that's one way to think about it. All right. Now, a fellow named Robert Sternberg said, you know what? Let's think of intelligence as a mental activity directed towards purposeful adaptation. That is surviving the best in your environment and in shaping your real world experience to fit your life. And so he thought that along with analytical intelligence, or what we would call school IQ or academic proficiency, he thought we ought to think about creativity, all right, as a form of intelligence. And he thought we ought to think about what he called practical intelligence, which is common sense or knowing what you're supposed to know given your situation. All right. So if a carpenter comes out to do repairs on your house and you ask your carpenter to tell you about red blood cells, and your carpenter says, I don't know what a red blood cell is, you're not going to make a judgment of that carpenter. You're going to say, you know what? This carpenter knows all about wood things and fixing houses. If your nurse, on the other hand, walks into your hospital room and you says, hey, can you tell me about my red blood count? And your nurse says, what's a red blood count? Uh, you would look and you would make a judgment about how clever that nurse is. So Sternberg said we ought to have sort of content relevant measures of intelligence. How many of you have worked with a coworker that doesn't know their job? And don't you make a judgment about that coworker's intelligence? Fred isn't very smart. He doesn't seem to know how to do his job, right? And so Sternberg says we should think about not only school intelligence, but creativity and knowing what you should know given your environment or your practical intelligence. Now, what are the criticisms of Sternberg's approach? He doesn't have a test. That's the main thing. He doesn't have a validated test. And remember, the IQ test has been validated and shown to be reliable after the age of 4. So IQ tests predict academic performance. They're valid that way. They're useful that way. They're very reliable. When you score on an IQ test at 4, you're going to score the same throughout the rest of your life. There's no such test for Robert Sternberg. Exactly. Comparing people similar to you in terms of their social environment. Absolutely right. And some scientists just don't think that creativity and practical intelligence represent innate intelligence. Instead, they would argue that creativity and practical intelligence are cultural artifacts, right? And remember, I told you earlier, we want to get cultural artifacts out of the test. So if his theory is full of that, then it's going to be hard for him to argue that what he's talking about is an innate form of intelligence. Okay, and finally, I've run out of time, but a fellow named Howard Gardner, who wrote this really cool book that I've read, Frames of Mind, he says we ought to think about intelligence as not just being 3 things, but being every ability that you have in your brain. Look at this picture right underneath me. This picture graphically represents the idea of modularity. Remember, I've been talking about modularity this semester. You have a mathematical spot in your brain. You have a spot which your hippocampus, which allows you to map locations really well. You have a part of your brain that moves your body around. You have a part of your brain in your temporal lobe that's responsible for musical knowledge. You have a part of your brain that's responsible for personality and emotional control. He says we ought to think about each one of these parts of the brain as being one part of intelligence. And so he says if you can find a part of the brain that controls a specific ability, if damage to that part of the brain impairs that specific ability, and if this thing shows a developmental trajectory, it develops like a natural ability, that you ought to think of this as a form of intelligence. And in using that theory, he discovered that he identifies what he thinks are 7 forms of intelligence. I've run out of time, so I'm going to just ask you to look over here and look at the different types of intelligence proposed by Gardner. The first 2 are what are measured on an IQ test, linguistic and mathematical forms of IQ. And then the bottom 2 are what he calls your personal intelligence, your ability to control your own emotions and your ability to interact successfully with other people. Now, he's got a great theory. It's a very biological theory, but he also doesn't have a validated test too. So the question is with IQ tests, yes, they're culturally biased. Yes, they only are useful in schools and courtroom settings. However, they do have very good value in these limited settings if you understand the cultural differences that they demonstrate. However, it would be cool if we could use these larger concepts to develop testing to maybe be more useful in other environments as well. Okay, does anybody have any questions about today's lecture? I am sorry for running on so long. Again, I had some technical problems I had to sort out. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with OBS this week. Don't forget, we have webinar tonight at 7 p.m. where we're going to be talking about these larger forms of intelligence. And I have a YouTube exam review tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Does anybody have any questions? Questions and comments? Hey, thanks for coming tonight. You folks are awesome as always. It's great to see you. Um, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a text. Otherwise, enjoy this beautiful day. Take care, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.